Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I'm going to be talking about sex. So, how do you make a sex conversation interesting and engaging without being over the top and putting people off? So, let's say you meet a potential partner and, on the back of everyone's mind is, how's the sex going to be with this person? I mean, if you've had a relationship at all and there's been any sex involved, I think that is the prevailing question. We can probably intuit a lot of other things. You look at a person, you know whether you think that they're attractive or not, and you probably know something about their smarts. You can do that in conversation. But in the back of our minds, we wonder about the sex part, because I think a lot of people who have had a sexual relationship that didn't quite meet their expectations, their feeling is, look, I want to know how the sex is going to be with this person, because I don't want to get in another relationship where the sex is kind of like, doesn't work for me. But how do you have that happen? I mean, some people would feel like, hey, why don't we just have sex to see if that works? And if that does work, then we can work on the rest of the relationship. Well, human nature being what it is, that doesn't really work either. And why is that? It's because sex is a very powerful distraction. You can ask a lot of people about that. So if you had a relationship at all when sex has been a part of it, then sex is something that you are going to want to look forward to. Of course, now while the awkwardness of an initial sex conversation may make a lot of people uncomfortable, but if you approach this with some sensitivity and maturity, I think you can overcome some of the initial uncomfortableness, awkwardness of this particular kind of conversation with someone who, when you're trying to make a good impression on them, you don't want to come off as being one-track minded. And sex can easily become one of those topics that just tends to dominate the conversation, as we say. So what do? You can meander from clinical vernacular to something a lot less clinical or more suggestive, or suggestive of a history capable of creating an essay. But here, we're at a point of wanting to talk about sex, but we don't want to send a signal to the other person about our motives and future intentions being anything other than honorable. So you just sort of stay on the surface with this and really gauge if the other person is comfortable talking about it. I think something that you want to do is you want to acknowledge to yourself that sex is important and why. So then when you're talking to the other person, you're able to convey to them in a way that's matter of fact. And that helps to have a conversation about a subject like this. I know sex is interesting, and because it is a part of the cycle of life, it would be nice if we actually knew a little bit more about it than we do. So you might have to be one of these individuals that does some serious research so that when you have a conversation about this, you don't just sound like you're talking like you just learned everything out of the streets. I mean, wow, that may be exciting and enticing at times. I think when you want to have a conversation about this, if you sound a little more refined, I think you can get into the conversation and then go, left or right of center. I think that's a way to start this conversation. So that's my advice on it. And, off the top, at some point in time, it will also be prudent to talk about your sexual history, but not necessarily right up front, because again, that suggests something else. So when you're talking about your sexual history, you can keep it in general. And, this way, like I said, you can gauge if the other person is comfortable or uncomfortable about the conversation. And being that one of the ways in which you can tell is you see how much they're sharing. So if you're sharing and they're sharing the same amount, the same kind of information, then you see it's mutual. But when it gets stilted, you got one person sharing a lot. I mean, not just because you're trying to fill the space because the other person might be uncomfortable, but you want to share and you want to give the other person an opportunity to share what they can. Now, if they're not very experienced, then maybe they don't have a whole lot to say, and maybe you are filling the space and you might be helping to draw them out. Now, that's something to look forward to, because you can do that with sex. I mean, we are all created by this act, and that's why there is so much written about it. Goes, like I say, left and right of center. You have those that are very clinical in their discussions about it. It doesn't necessarily sound interesting because it's clinical, and it might even sound a bit highbrow. But that is a way to get into the conversation and not make it so incredibly graphic. Because remember, we don't want graphic yet. This is not the time for that. When you are really familiar with each other, then you can figure out where the two of you come together on this. But right now, we're just going to stay in the safe zone, because we're trying to talk about sex and not have it be something that makes people feel creepy about it. So what are the ways in which you can have a conversation about sex and keep it interesting? Well, there are classes that are given on, for couples, on improving their communication. And some of it has to do with their physicality, how they express that. There are classes there are lectures, and I've been on the college campuses, and many professors who are in the business of teaching human sexuality, there are lots of videos out there that they may have you do some research on, and there may be lectures that you have to attend to do some work. So if you're college age and you have that to avail yourself to, hey, invite your person of interest to maybe a lecture that's being given on it. Another thing that you can do is you can share a book or read it together and learn something about human sexuality. There's always a lot to learn. One of the things that I've heard women discuss and to no end is some of the short-sightedness that men have about what women's sexual needs are. So to the guys that are listening, this is an area in which you can score a lot of points. Do a little research, read a book about women's needs, and have a way of being in conversation about that, and I think you will be able to hold her interest. Guys seem to know quite a bit about pornography, but when it comes to knowing what women want for themselves, or even finding a way to be in conversation about that, again, that doesn't make them uncomfortable, but actually shows an interest, you can win a lot of points that way. And for the women who are listening to this podcast, wondering how do you talk to a guy about sex, be matter of fact about it. I mean, be interesting, be interested, but be matter of fact about it, because it is something that I think as a woman that you want to have a good sexual relationship with your partner. Being healthy, I mean, doing all the things. I mean, think about this. Think about all the work that you will put into having a relationship with somebody. You want somebody who is thoughtful and will open the door for you, and who's chivalrous, somebody that shows that they care about you. And I would think someone who is willing to be a listener to whatever your concerns are. And this is one of those topics in which you can cover. And I think he will be keenly interested in what you have to say. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to talk about this a whole lot more. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Now, where I left off in that last segment, I was talking about women taking an active role in having this conversation about sex early enough in the relationship so that you realize that it's a partnership. And I was giving some tips on how to have a conversation so that it doesn't get derailed and getting into the creepy zone. But what I want to focus on at this point is really suggesting to women that you take an active role in being in the conversation. I mean, it's perfectly all right, I think, to bring it up as a topic because it's of interest to you. Now, I'm sure one of the interesting things that I find that women do, I'm tacking to the left here. One of the interesting things that I find that women do is when they talk about sex, I think every woman that I've spoken to about the subject has a story about a guy who thought he was all that and wound up not being that. And not that you have to necessarily share that story with your new partner, but it's to say that this is one of the reasons why you want to take an interest in letting your partner know that you've had bad sex and that you don't want to have that again. You're not interested in that. You want somebody who is willing to take care of themselves. It's great when, all the window dressing is there. They look good. They dress well. Sometimes they, flash a lot of money, but when it comes to bedroom etiquette, it is definitely one of those things in life that it's a partnership. You got to share in that. You have to both feel like you're getting your needs met. And it's not about one person dominating the bedroom, so to speak. I was going to use another euphemism, but you got to have fun with this. And I think we can talk about it in a matter of fact, even lighthearted way that gets the point across, but be willing to do that. Don't shrink back from that because of, as the old expression is, don't stand on ceremony. I think so many people have felt that when it comes to certain conversations, that other person, when they bring it up, then I'll talk about it. No, be the initiator of something like this because you're coming from a position of strength when you initiate the conversation. If you're waiting for somebody to have that subject come up, it's as if you're waiting for somebody to give you permission. You don't. Speak for yourself. And while you're having this topic of conversation, it gives you an opportunity to introduce things that you find that don't work for you. You can talk about something that is important to you, safe sex. And if the conversation goes there, what happened early on, but if the conversation goes there, you'll talk a little bit about your sexual history in the interest of saying, look, we need to be honest with each other. And if we can't, or if I find out that you're not being honest, then that's a deal breaker. Because that's a pretty important thing to be able to talk about openly and directly. And I have found that when that topic of conversation comes up early in the connection, if you have herpes, and 70% of the population does, that's not a shame here. But if you do, then you want to communicate that up front, because for some people that's a deal breaker. That way you don't wind up wasting your time with somebody, or I wouldn't say maybe I should take back the word wasting. I don't mean it in that sense. What I do mean to say is, if the person is going to have something like that that's a deal breaker for them, then it allows them to move on to someone else and allows you to take your time and find someone who's more of a match for who you are. Now, with all that having been said, something I want you to consider is, so that this conversation about sex isn't just something that's off the cuff, just off the top of your head. I mean, it can get there, but I think what I would like you to do is write down your concerns or your desires about sex. So this is when the conversation comes up, because you've given it some thought, it actually becomes very engaging. I mean, off the top of the head kind of conversations, anything that pops off can be interesting. But if you're not necessarily good at that, especially with this particular subject, because we want to share, but then we don't want to share too much. And by sort of writing down your own history and your own concerns, you can decide where and how much you're comfortable with sharing. And when I say where, it's about where you want the conversation to go, how much you're comfortable about sharing with a particular individual. And as you, say, warm up not only to the conversation, but to the person you're talking with, then you get a sense of what the chemistry is like. It's one thing to sort of make it up in your own mind, but when you get into these conversations with people, and so here's an example. When I talked about sharing, you don't want to overshare. You want the other person to share as much as you are, so that way it doesn't sort of get out of balance. I mean, you don't feel overexposed. And when the other person you're talking to sort of intuitively fills that gap, see, that's a sort of chemistry that suggests, well, things are going the right direction. And you like to be able to feel those things out. And not just about sex, but about a wide range of topics. Now, the sex happens to be what we're talking about because of this program. But as you get into the conversation, lots of other things can come up. Maybe a trip that you had taken somewhere with this previous lover, and that idea pops into your head. So you might talk about vacation spots, or maybe some awkward circumstances that you got into because of something else that happened. You see, conversations come about because of all kinds of ways, and it's interesting to find your niche with another person. And when it starts to gel, when it really starts to click and you feel it, then the relationship has some potential, and you can begin discussing the relationship from that aspect as well. So this is the art of conversation. I mean, if you haven't figured that part out, put some thought into it. Think of a particular subject matter where something that's interesting to you, and when the opportunity, especially in these one-on-one situations, when the opportunity comes about that you can discuss it, and something like sex, which really gets a lot of buy-in from the individuals who are talking, then you never know what can happen. And I like to invite you to invest that time in yourself and learn something significant about you. And I think having the vulnerability to want to share that says a lot about you and your desire to be in a relationship with someone. That's a good thing. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after these commercials.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and the topic is talking about sex. So the first couple of segments I talked about basically being comfortable with it, having a conversation with somebody who is a person of interest in your life, in being the lead if you need to, and also some guidelines for keeping the conversation going forward and not weirding people out, because sometimes even when we're having a conversation just about general stuff, we might get off into the weeds. So basically, I kind of kept you on the highway. Now, something I want to tack a little bit of a different direction. Tack, that's a term that they use in sailing, if that sounds a little foreign to you. But if in the talk about sex, in just as a subject, if it is something that you're uncomfortable with, and I'm just reaching out through this podcast that if you're someone who has had some sort of sexual trauma, meaning you've had a really bad experience with it and you need someone to talk to, then I am going to highly suggest that you find a counselor who will give you the space to talk about the subject. And oftentimes these kinds of things are something that you may not even be aware of at the moment, but as some uncomfortableness comes up around it, it may be reaching into some of the dark areas of your life that you may have suppressed. And quite often, when these things come up, it surprises you. It may come up because there's a conversation that about a particular subject that makes it become more apparent that something happened that you may have, like I say, may have suppressed. I encourage you to talk to a professional so that you can get help around that, so it isn't something that becomes an obstacle to your growth in many areas. And people who have suffered some sort of sexual trauma, some sort of abuse, they're survivors. And I'm glad that you have been able to get to wherever you are in life now. But if this is something that's hanging out there for you, I want to encourage you. I want to give you a little nudge in the direction of talking and getting professional help so that it is not something that is going to stop you the rest of your life. Because these things happen, and sometimes we don't know who to turn to, who to trust. And there are more and more resources out there for people. And we recognize that people have suffered things and have suppressed it for years. So I hope that serves as an encouragement to get yourself the help that you need. So now I'd like to pivot back to the other parts of the topic that I was talking about, and one of which is to remind you that sex is something to enjoy, something to have fun with, enjoy it, make it something that you can share with your partner, and really embrace the giving and receiving of pleasure and commit to enjoying the process, whatever it is. It may not be excellent, outstanding in the beginning, but as a couple, it's something that you work on, just like anything else. And if you've never made being physically intimate with your partner a priority, learn to do that from time to time. Practice that. Make each other the focus, because there are so many other things out there that are vying for your time, pulling you away from the things that you enjoy. And if you find something like this that you can really enjoy with your partner, then engage in it without shame, because this is one of those gifts that you as a human being are capable of experiencing. And why not do that with someone you love and get that feeling of satisfaction, both giving and receiving that love. And just so that you know, there is no age limit on this in terms of how old can you continue to have a good sexual experience. There's no age limit on it. There's no ceiling on that. As long as you're capable and feel that you can enjoy it and engage in a sex life, then you do so. I would hope that you wouldn't deprive yourself of that. And if it's something that you haven't done in a while and you're trying to get back into it, well, do it. Do some reading, watch some movies, and there's all kinds of things that you can view, and a lot of them aren't pornographic. They're not really graphic, so if that's something that you're not comfortable with, there are videos that show you things and techniques that I think the average person could watch and enjoy and appreciate. That it's less cinematic, and it's not like I say about the more edgier graphic things about sex, but it's oftentimes people who haven't been sexual in a while probably have forgotten more things than they remember, and this is a gentle way of being reminded of some things. So if you're older and you haven't had a lover for a while, well, here's an opportunity to re-engage yourself and make that part of your human experience. Embrace that which is truly authentic of you, and find someone who you want to share that love with, who would love to be the recipient of that. And with all of that being said, sometimes being a good lover requires some work. So don't expect that this thing is just automatic. As I've mentioned time and time before, you need to invest yourself in it, get yourself some education about it. You can do some reading, share that with your partner. Make an event out of it that you and your lover can have the one-on-one time, knowing that you are that special to each other. Now, for a lot of you, we're going to be getting out of your comfort zone. So don't let that stop you. Just ease into it and speak your truth. Share with your partner that, hey, this is something that I'm not completely comfortable with, but I'm willing to go through that experience with you because this is a significant step for us, and it'll be memorable. And with all of that having been said, remember to love your partner, practice healthy, safe sex, and this has been John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I want to thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.